Hey there, everybody. This is Jonathan Lane from Fan Film Factor. I am the writer and executive producer of the Axanar Universe fan film, Interlude. This project was a true labor of love. Everybody who worked on it really did their best. From our director of photography and editor, Joshua Irwin, to our composer, Kevin Croxton, to our wonderful actors, our amazing extras, our first assistant director, our makeup people, our hair people, our costuming people, and of course our incredible director, Victoria Fox. Throughout the development of Interlude, I posted a series of blog features, interviews, and behind-the-scenes videos spotlighting various aspects of pre-production, production, and now post-production. And today I've got something I'm really excited to share with all of you. I'm going to show you the very first rough cut that Joshua Irwin edited back in January of 2020. Then I'm going to go through that very first edit with all of you, shot by shot, and explain to you all the changes that were made and why, at least for me, we made those changes. And then I'll show you the final edit, what we call a picture lock, which was sent to Kevin Croxton to add the music. But before I begin, I need to give a big shout out to Josh and Victoria for letting me be a part of the editing process. See, usually in post-production, it's the director and the editor who go through all of the raw footage, make the selects of which takes are the best, and cut it all together, and then present it to the executive producer after they go through the whole editing process. But when I started making Interlude, I wanted to be part of the entire development process, from budgeting and pre-production through production, and also post-production. I knew I might never have another opportunity like this. I really wanted to be in the trenches with Josh and Victoria as they edited Interlude, and I am so thankful that they allowed me to do it with them. I'm sure it was no picnic having the executive producer along for the ride, not just watching, but actively involved in every decision. I know I drove them crazy. But for me, it was the culmination of the experience of a lifetime. And that's why I want to thank them, because As an executive producer, I normally wouldn't get a chance to be involved in post-production, and instead, they allowed me to work with them, and I could never thank them enough. Okay, before I show you the rough cut, let me tell you just a little bit about what a rough cut is. Now, you started with your script, and then you filmed everything in a studio. You created your visual effects shots like this one, you created all of your raw footage, and now it's time to put the pieces of the puzzle together for the first time. But there's many ways to do that, and there's no one right way to edit a film. Maybe some takes are better than others. Maybe it's a good idea to put in a reaction shot to break up a scene. There's so many different ways to put together an edit. But you've got to start somewhere, and that's what the rough cut is, the starting point. Now, your starting point and your ending point are not supposed to be the same. In fact, editing is actually one of the most important parts of your entire film production. A powerful edit can save even the weakest of films, and a bad edit can ruin even the best of films. So the editor assembles the rough cut, knowing that it's going to change. Now, the last thing I'll mention is that this initial rough cut was put together before we filmed the footage for the epilogue part at the end. So you won't see the older Garth interview or the Admiral Slater interview. Everything ends just as the Ares is warping back to Earth. Additionally, I'll also mention that we hadn't yet filmed the footage of the chief engineer of the USS Artemis, but at the time we were expecting it was going to be Paul Jenkins playing that character. So instead of using Paul's footage, Josh just put in a holder image of Paul's Facebook image. I mention this because at the time, Paul's profile picture was very, very odd. It was a picture of him smoking 2 cigarettes. We did not put that in there as a way of making fun of Paul in any way. That was his profile picture at the time that this was put together. So with that, let me stop this playback of the final version of Interlude and instead show you what the very first rough cut looked like back in January of 2020. Don't try to adjust your sound. This was the initial cut that did not have any audio effects yet. So anytime you see visual effects during the rough cut, it's going to be completely silent.
Burgess, take engineering. Helm, hold her steady. We need some distance between us and those battle cruisers.
I'm trying, sir. Those monsters are fast.
Damage report.
Shields holding at 60%, aft torpedoes disabled, impulse engines damaged but still operative. We have warp power, but not for long.
Bridge, this is engineering. Garth, what the hell are you doing to my ship?
Alexei, divert all non-essential power to the aft shields. Keep those warp engines intact. Mr. Tanaka's on his way down to assist.
Do the impossible. Aye. Engineering out.
And it's not your ship. Com, get me the Artemis.
Captain Jaconde on main viewer, sir.
I guess Karn finally got his D7s launched. Would you look at the size of those things?
Status on the Artemis, Captain.
Shields are at 72%, warp and impulse engines intact. Minor casualties.
2, 1, bang.
So far. Just our luck the first D7 attack would happen here.
I don't believe in coincidence, Captain.
Are you saying the Klingons knew we'd be here? How can that be? Only a handful of Starfleet officials knew our course vectors or who we'd be transporting. Do you know what you're saying, Garth?
It's the only explanation. We have a spy. Jaconde. Kane, status on comms.
Communications relay overload, Captain. I'm rerouting now. Just give me a minute.
Franklin, damage report.
Hull breach on deck 6, emergency bulkheads in place.
Captain, I have Ramirez in sickbay. He's been hit. He's in critical condition. I need to operate, but I can't while the ship is being blasted apart.
Understood. The ship gets blasted apart, it's not going to matter. Kane, I need comms now.
Thanks for calling me back. I thought you'd hung up on me.
Ramirez is in sickbay. He's critical.
Get out of here, Garth, now. We'll handle this.
Jump to warp with us. With any luck, we can both make it back to the fleet.
No. Those D7s are faster than us. Starfleet can afford to lose both our ships plus Ramirez. We'll handle the battle cruisers. Helm, come about.
Chakande, no. We'll beam Ramirez to you. We can lower our ventral shields just long enough to get in.
Captain, we've just taken heavy damage to the ventral power conduits. It's knocked out the transporters.
Damn it. Chakande, can you beam Ramirez?
Our transporters are out too. Garth, this is the only way. You've got to get Ramirez out of here now. Engineering, slow to 1/4 impulse. Start venting warp plasma. We've got to make it seem like we've been crippled. And Commander, be prepared to shut down antimatter containment. On my mark. Captain. I know.
Chakande.
It's been an honor serving with you, Captain Garth. Now get the hell out of here. Helm, hard about.
The honor is ours, Artemis. Helm, warp factor 7. Now.
Engineering, shut down antimatter containment unit now.
Captain, antimatter explosion, sir. Artemis is gone. The Klingon ships are no longer pursuing us.
Mr. DeVille, get us back to Earth. Best speed.
And there you go. That was the first time that I saw Interlude. Now you're probably thinking, this doesn't look that different than the final version. And you're right, but there are some very interesting changes that we made along the way, and I'd like to share those with you. So let's watch the rough cut again, in short segments this time. And I'll point out some of the big things that were changed, and also some of the very subtle nuances that you might not have noticed. And then, after each segment, I will show you how that segment turned out in the final picture lock. Alright, let's start. Now, as you probably know, this opening scene is actually the very last shot from Prelude to Axanar. So we recreated that, and then we expanded on it to show what the Klingons were shooting at, which obviously here is the Artemis and the USS Ares. Now, this sequence didn't actually change between the rough cut and the final picture lock version. In fact, we actually created it way back before we kicked off the initial crowdfunding campaign, because this was going to be our proof of concept to say, hey, look, this is what it's going to look like. This is the quality of the visual effects. But I did want to mention a few things while I'm here. So these visual effects were created by my friend Louis Anderson. That's not his real name, he's using a pseudonym. But I was the one who was the storyboard artist. I was the supervisor of the video effects. So a lot of these are my ideas. Like, for example, here at the beginning, I wanted us to fly right into the photon torpedo launcher and then switch around so that we're seeing the exact same shot from the other side. But I also wanted to make sure that in all of these cases, things were coming directly at the camera, like right here, boom. You see, from the first moment, I wanted the viewer to be really engaged. I wanted the shot to come right in their face, directly in their face. And then it was very important to show which two ships were being fired upon. So we had this pan to show that the Artemis and a second later, the Ares are the two ships that are involved. Okay, moving on to the next clip.
Burgess, take engineering.
I love this sequence so much. It was so difficult to do. Josh was standing with a camera on top of a ladder. We had all of these people moving simultaneously. The turbolift doors had opened at just the right time. The people going in couldn't run into the person coming out. Everybody has to do their jolt at the exact same moment. Then Garth delivers his line with a commanding presence.
Burgess, take engineering.
All while the people behind the set are flicking the lights on and off. It was an amazing 10-second sequence, unlike anything I've ever seen in any Star Trek fan film. I think we had like 15 or 18 people involved in this shot, both in front of the camera, behind the sets. It took multiple attempts to get this right. In fact, let me show you, for those of you who didn't see it in my previous blog, what the behind-the-scenes filming of this scene looked like, because it's really, really interesting. Let's take a look.
Rolling.
Camera speed.
Audio speed. And action actors. That urgency is up. Great, thank you. Crystal. 2, 1, bang. Doors.
Burgess, take engineering.
1, 2, close. Fucking nailed it, y'all.
That looked awesome.
Good job, man.
Yeah, I know that looks so simple and so smooth, but that little 10-second sequence took us about 20 minutes of practicing and just doing take after take after take until we got it just right. Anyway, after all that hard work and this amazing sequence, here's what made it into the final picture lock. Did you blink and miss it? Here, take a look again. Yep, that beautiful, amazing 10-second sequence cut down to just 2 seconds. Now, in a previous blog post, I explained why, but the main reason is just that we're in the middle of battle. The scenes have to cut really, really fast, one to the next, to the next, to the next. Each shot in our opening sequence lasts for only 2, 3, 4 seconds at the most. To include a 10-second sequence, no matter how good it looks, would just stop the action dead. So Josh and Victoria told me, they said, you never fall in love with anything, any shot that you film, because you have to do what's best for the film. And in this case, that meant cutting out 8 beautiful seconds so that the film would move faster at the very, very beginning, which is the most important thing. Now, let's move back to the rough cut. And you'll see that the next 2 shots in the sequence, which are also very, very fast shots, essentially stayed the same throughout the entire editing process up through picture lock.
Helm, hold her steady. We need some distance between us and those battle cruisers.
I'm trying, sir. Those monsters are fast.
And here's the picture lock version.
Helm, hold her steady. We need some distance between us and those battle cruisers.
I'm trying, sir. Those monsters are fast.
Now, a quick side note, you may have noticed that the rough cut is in a 16:9 aspect ratio, but the picture lock is in the widescreen format of 21:9. So obviously the raw footage was filmed in the standard format and then trimmed down to the widescreen later on during the editing process. Now, you might have noticed that's not the case for the visual effects shots, and that's because they were rendered widescreen pretty much from the very beginning. And speaking of the visual effects, let's go back to the rough cut. Again, there's no sound, but I do want to talk about a couple of things about this shot and this shot. This really, really cool shot that I love. It's one of my favorite shots of the entire film. Now, you might remember I was talking about the opening sequence, those 3 VFX shots, that I had a lot of input into the storyboarding and the layout and how they finally came out. That's not the case with these two shots. In fact, I gave Lewis Anderson a lot of freedom to just take what was a written description of the scenes and do whatever he wanted with it. Here's the exact description as it was written for him. Starboard flanking D7 in the foreground, lead and port flank D7 in the background. Camera starts in front of the foreground ship and arcs around the ship's bow until the other two ships become visible in profile. They fire their disruptors from their forward emitters. Now, obviously, it didn't come out looking exactly like it was described, but honestly, I had no complaints whatsoever when I saw this. Now, here's what Lewis got for the second shot. Lead D7 fires a torpedo. Camera tracks with the torpedo, arcing around to its rear side and follows it to the impact on the Ares aft port impulse engine. And from that brief description, which was written by Josh, we got this amazing shot. Now let's see how it looked in the picture lock version. Now you're probably noticing that the picture lock version has some temporary sound effects. These were put in by Josh as a guide for both Kevin Croxton, our composer, as well as Mark Edward Lewis, who did the sound mixing later on. I'll play it for you one more time without the commentary. And now back to the rough cut.
Damage report.
Shields holding at 60%, aft torpedoes disabled, impulse engines damaged but still operative. We have warp power, but not for long.
This is Jay Plyburn playing Science Officer Franklin. He's been in 6 of Josh Irwin's films, and he agreed to do ours, which I really do appreciate. Even though Franklin's a pretty small part, it's actually one of the most challenging roles that we had in all of Interlude. And the reason is that his dialogue is just a list of everything that's broken on the ship. There's nothing really to sink your teeth into. And of course, it's a long bit of dialogue that you just have to memorize and get through. But Jay is a professional actor, and he put his all into it, and he gave us some really, really good takes, and this was one of them. Let's watch it one more time.
Shields holding at 60%, aft torpedoes disabled, impulse engines damaged but still operative. We have warp power, but not for long.
Now, selecting the best take is always an arbitrary decision. So initially, Josh went with this one, but Jay gave us 3 solid takes, and I liked one of the other ones, so that was the one we ended up using. See if you can spot the differences, and afterwards I'll tell you why I preferred that one over this one.
Damage report.
Shields holding at 60%, aft torpedoes disabled, impulse engines damaged but still operative. We have warp power, but not for long.
As I said, it's completely arbitrary. But when it came down to it, I just liked the way he said, but not for long, in the second version. Here's the first version again.
We have warp power, but not for long.
And the second.
We have warp power, but not for long.
And it really was as arbitrary as that. Josh and Victoria were fine with that select, so that's the one we went with. Okay, moving on.
Bridge, this is engineering. Garth, what the hell are you doing to my ship?
Alexei, divert all non-essential power to the aft shields. Keep those warp engines intact. Mr. Tanaka's on his way down to assist.
Do the impossible. Aye. Engineering out.
And it's not your ship. Com, get me the Artemis.
Hey, before we go on, you want to hear something really cool? Before actor Jamie Rennell came on to do Leonov's voice, we had a different person recording Leonov's line. See if you can guess who it was.
Bridge, this is engineering. Garth, what are you doing to my ship?
Alexei, divert all non-essential power to the aft shields. Keep those warp engines intact. Mr. Tanaka's on his way down to assist.
Do the impossible. Just like always. Aye, sir. Engineering out.
And it's not your ship. Com, get me the Artemis.
Yep, before we had Jamie Rennell, I was going to do the voice of Leonov. Fortunately for Interlude, Jamie Rennell, who is going to be playing Leonov in the Axanar sequels, agreed to do the voiceover for us, so we were spared from my Russian accent. Now, before we go on, for anybody who has an issue with Alec Peters acting, I want to point out something about this scene. Alec has a lot of things that he needs to do. The first is he has to hold his head in just the right spot for the entire sequence because he's got light right on the corner of it. Now he starts out listening to somebody talking to him for about 3 seconds, and he has to react to it. Then he has to deliver about 7 seconds of non-stop, fast-paced, complex dialogue. Then he has to wait for another 4 seconds, like he's listening to somebody who's exasperating to hear. And then finally, he has to bring it all home with one of the only comedy lines in this otherwise very serious fan film. Oh, and at the end, he can't miss a beat. He has to turn to communications and give an order. So keeping all that in mind, let's take a look at the sequence one more time.
Bridge, this is engineering. Garth, what the hell are you doing to my ship?
Alexei, divert all non-essential power to the aft shields. Keep those warp engines intact. Mr. Tanaka's on his way down to assist.
Do the impossible. Aye. Engineering out.
And it's not your ship. Com, get me the Artemis.
So give credit where credit is due. That is not easy. That said, I wasn't thrilled with the way that Alec delivered the comedy line in that take. However, Alec did some other takes, and one of them had a really understated version of that line that I loved, and that's the one we went with. So let's take a look at the way that turned out in the picture lock.
We have warp power, but not for long.
Bridge, this is engineering. Garth, what the hell are you doing to my ship?
Alexei, divert all non-essential power to the aft shields. Keep those warp engines intact. Mr. Tanaka's on his way down to assist.
Do the impossible. Aye. Engineering out.
And it's not your ship.
Reserve battery power down to 53%.
Com, get me the Artemis.
Oh, lots of good stuff to talk about there. First, let's just compare the two deliveries of the line, and it's not your ship.
And it's not your ship. And it's not your ship.
For me, no contest. By the way, that line came from a character description that Alec had initially written up for Chief Engineer Leonov. Starfleet engineers tend to be a little quirky, and they certainly feel very protective of their ships. And this is definitely true for Leonov. So the gag is that Leonov sort of thinks of the USS Ares as his, Leonov's ship, and that Garth is just borrowing it. So I always sort of imagine the line, and it's not your ship, as something that Garth has probably said 100,000 times. Now, speaking of Leonov, the fact is that even though we had Jamie Rennell doing the voice of Leonov, we didn't have him on camera. And I thought that Josh's solution of having the visual feed be an operative was absolutely brilliant. And you'll also notice that Garth is no longer listening to Leonov at the beginning. We are focused on the armrest, and then we cut to Garth. Now, you might be aware that we re-recorded Jamie. A lot of people thought he sounded too Scottish in this version, so we got a more Russian voiceover.
Do the impossible. Aye. Engineering out.
So that was the first version. Let me play you the final version.
Bridge, this is engineering. Garth, what the hell are you doing to my ship?
Alexei, divert all non-essential power to the aft shields. Keep those warp engines intact. Mr. Tanaka's on his way down to assist.
Do the impossible. Duh. Same as always. Engineering out.
And it's not your ship.
And then, of course, Josh decided to cut away for a moment to this insert of the USS Artemis on the view screen before cutting back to Garth turning to communications to give the order. And once more, back to the rough cut.
Com, get me the Artemis.
Captain Jakande on main viewer, sir.
I guess Karn finally got his D7s launched. Would you look at the size of those things?
This time I'm going to go directly to the picture lock and show you how it turned out, and then we'll discuss the changes and why they were made.
Com, get me the Artemis.
Phaser overload, still preventing recharge.
Captain, the Ares is hailing us, sir.
Captain Jakande on main viewer, sir.
Guess Karn finally got his D7s launched. Would you look at the size of those things?
Now, the first thing you'll notice is we added in this shot, and one of the reasons for that is that there's a whole bunch of people in it that otherwise would not have been seen in the fan film had we not included this shot. And it's a fan film. I just wanted to have as many people who showed up be on screen as possible. However, adding in this scene meant we also had to have the communications officer record this line separately.
Captain, the Ares is hailing us, sir.
That way we could cut back to the Ares communications officer saying this.
Captain Jakande on main viewer, sir.
And then we get to see Jakande there in the main viewer with his Star Wars line.
Would you look at the size of those things?
Yep, I went there. Anyway, let's go back to the rough cut for just a few seconds, and I'm going to show you two other things that we changed.
I guess Karn finally got his D7s launched. Would you look at the size of those things?
Okay, three things that we changed, because we completely got rid of that Klingon D7 console cutaway, because that just wasn't working. We also got rid of that little text stuff on the bottom of the view screen. Josh wanted to try it, but I don't think in the end any of us liked it, so it disappeared pretty quickly in the editing process. Now, the last thing we had a little bit of an issue with is that Warren Hawk, who's playing Jaconde, he steps on the screen and then he sort of bounces back and forth. Now, I'm sure you've heard the phrase, "we'll fix it in post." Well, we're in post and we need to fix it. Obviously, we can't stop him from swaying, but we're in the middle of a space battle. So I checked with our genius editor, Josh, and it turns out that yes, he can add camera shake later on, even if the camera's not shaking. So Josh shook the camera a little bit in post, added some explosion sounds, and this is what happened.
Guess Karn finally got his D7s launched. Would you look at the size of those things?
Almost looks like we planned it that way the whole time, doesn't it? Meanwhile, back at the rough cut.
Status on the Artemis, Captain.
Shields are at 72%. Warp and impulse engines intact. Minor casualties.
2, 1, bang.
So far. Just our luck the first D7 attack would happen here.
Oh, such a good take. Perfect. Except for one thing. Did you spot it? Here, take another look.
Status on the Artemis, Captain.
Shields are at 72%. Warp and impulse engines intact. Minor casualties.
Did you see it that time?
Status on the Artemis, Captain.
Oops. Yeah, the lower cushion came detached from the Velcro in a previous take. Now, most people probably wouldn't have noticed that, but enough people would that, nope, we couldn't use that take. Unfortunately, nobody noticed that when we were actually on the set filming. So that was our last take and we moved on from there. But each of the previous takes had a little something wrong with it. This was our best option.
Looks like Karn finally got those D7s launched. Would you look at the size of those things? Shields are at 72%. Warp and impulse engines intact. Minor casualties.
2, 1, bang.
So far.
The take's really good, except there's too long of a pause before minor casualties.
Warp and impulse engines intact. Minor casualties.
Even William Shatner would have said, your pause was too long. And we couldn't just edit out the pause because then you get this noticeable jump in the camera.
Warp and impulse engines intact. Minor casualties.
Fortunately, though, Josh filmed this line of dialogue from multiple different angles. So even though it wasn't the most optimal solution, we did have this option available to us.
Status on the Artemis, Captain.
Shields are at 72%. Warp and impulse engines intact. Minor casualties. So far.
Not bad, huh? Now, this next part of the rough cut contains a sequence that unfortunately did not make it into the final version.
I don't believe in coincidence, Captain.
Are you saying the Klingons knew we'd be here? How can that be? Only a handful of Starfleet officials knew our course vectors or who we'd be transporting. Do you know what you're saying, Garth?
I blogged about this recently, but right before Jaconde says, "Do you know what you're saying, Garth?" there was supposed to be a line from Garth where he provides some exposition about this being an ambush, and he goes on about how the Klingons had to have known who was aboard. Unfortunately, a last-minute script change on set resulted in Alec never recording that line on camera. So we just didn't have it. And rather than having an awkward cut from Jaconde to Jaconde, we just got rid of that bit of dialogue entirely.
So far. Just our luck the first D7 attack would happen here.
I don't believe in coincidence, Captain.
Do you know what you're saying, Garth?
By the way, I don't know if you noticed at the very beginning, but when Jaconde says, "just our luck," we cut away to Garth, and that allows us to use a different take that was even better of Jaconde delivering that line.
So far. Just our luck the first D7 attack would happen here.
I don't believe in coincidence, Captain.
Do you know what you're saying, Garth?
As we go back to the rough cut, the next line from Garth, I wasn't really thrilled with the delivery.
It's the only explanation. We have a spy.
But that's why you should always shoot multiple takes, because we had this option instead.
It's the only explanation. We have a spy.
Nailed it. Now, I should qualify that. In my opinion, that was a better take than the previous one. Other people might not agree with me. But that's the thing. In editing, there's no one right answer. Sometimes Josh and Victoria agreed with me, and sometimes they didn't. And sometimes we used my select, and sometimes we used their select. Okay, back to the rough cut.
We have a spy.
I love that reaction shot. I also love this shot, especially right here.
Jaconde. Kane, status on comms.
Communications relay overload, Captain. I'm rerouting now. Just give me a minute.
Not much change between that and the picture lock, but you'll be able to see some of the post-production visual effects that Josh was able to add in.
We have a spy.
Failing in emergency transporters. Rerouting.
Jaconde. Kane, status on comms.
Communications relay overload, Captain. I'm rerouting now. Just give me a minute.
Now, this next part of the rough cut actually includes something that's kind of unusual.
I'm rerouting now. Just give me a minute.
Franklin, damage report.
Hull breach on deck 6, emergency bulkheads in place.
Usually with rough cuts, the editor will start with more than he needs and then trim down from there. But this was one of those rare times where more dialogue was added because I wanted Franklin's full damage report to show how badly the areas had been hit.
I'm rerouting now. Just give me a minute.
Franklin, damage report.
Hull breach on deck 6, emergency bulkheads in place. Phaser banks 3 and 4 damaged. Auxiliary control circuits temporarily disabled. Casualties.
Sickbay to bridge.
Now, Josh and Victoria didn't want to hold on the full damage report because it goes on for 10 seconds. So instead, they cut away to this console display of what Franklin is reading. And then they cut back to Franklin, and then the doctor interrupts him.
Casualties.
Sickbay to bridge.
So just like we had in that opening sequence, we didn't want a long 10-second shot. So Josh and Victoria cut it in such a way that no one shot lasts for more than 3 or 4 seconds maximum. It's much more exciting and fast-paced that way. Okay, as we go back to the rough cut, you're going to hear something that's going to be very unusual.
Captain, I have Ramirez in sickbay. He's been hit. He's in critical condition. I need to operate, but I can't while the ship is being blasted apart.
That short sickbay segment was filmed at Warp 66 Studios in northeastern Arkansas during a tornadic ice storm. What you're hearing over Victoria's dialogue is the sound of rain and hail hitting the roof. And yes, that is our director, Victoria Fox, holding the communicator. She's actually a trained actor, which is good because she had to ADR her lines. ADR is when you record something later in a sound studio booth, and you have to try to match as closely as you can the lip movements of what you said as you try to re-record it. And we had no choice but to re-record it because there was no way to clean up the sound of Victoria's lines with all the rain and the hail hitting the roof. Also notice the communicator that the doctor is holding. That's one of those Mego toys from the 1970s. Unfortunately, it looks like a Mego toy from the 1970s. So at my request, or I should say my pain in the ass request, Joshua put in about 15 to 20 hours, frame by frame, recoloring that communicator. So I'd like you to appreciate it when you take a look. I'm actually going to switch and show you the final version of Interlude because Josh didn't have the recoloring done at the picture lock stage.
Casualties.
Remember to appreciate that communicator and watch how closely Victoria's lips are syncing to what she's saying.
Captain, I have Ramirez in sickbay. He's been hit. He's in critical condition. I need to operate, but I can't while the ship is being blasted apart.
Understood.
Oh, that just came out so nicely. So kudos to Victoria for doing such a great lip sync and also for doing all that great fake blood on Ramirez's uniform. And then Josh gets a round of applause for just making that communicator look gorgeous and also for adding in some great visual effects to this shot afterwards. By the way, when Garth says, "Go ahead, Doctor," at the beginning of the scene, That line was actually recorded by Alec into a cell phone, of all things, months later, just so we would have that line at the beginning of the scene. Meanwhile, back at the rough cut.
Understood. The ship gets blasted apart. It's not going to matter. Kane, I need comms now.
But we had a better take than that.
The ship gets blasted apart. It's not going to matter. Kane, I need comms now.
I love those post-production sparks. Now, the next few take selects made it through unchanged to the picture lock.
Kane, I need comms now.
Thanks for calling me back. I thought you'd hung up on me.
Ramirez is in sickbay. He's critical.
Get out of here, Garth. Now. We'll handle this.
Jump to warp with us. With any luck, we can both make it back to the fleet.
In fact, as you'll see, with the exception of a couple of visual effects shots, the only thing we changed was the framing of this final scene to be a wider shot over the shoulder of Jakande looking at the bridge in the view screen.
Kane, I need comms now.
Emergency evacuation protocols in place for main deflector
Thanks for
section.
calling me back. I thought you'd hung up on me.
Ramirez is in sickbay. He's critical.
Get out of here, Garth. Now. We'll handle this.
Jump to warp with us. With any luck, we can both make it back to the fleet.
And again, the next few takes were pretty much perfect in the rough cut, so they made it through to the picture lock.
With any luck, we can both make it back to the fleet.
No. Those D7s are faster than us. Starfleet can't afford to lose both our ships plus Ramirez. We'll handle the battle cruisers. Helm, come about.
Jakande, no. We'll beam Ramirez to you. We can lower our ventral shields just long enough to get in.
Captain, we've just taken heavy damage to the ventral power conduits. It's knocked out the transporters.
Damn it. Jakande, can you beam Ramirez?
Our transporters are out too. Garth, this is the only way. You've got to get Ramirez out of here now.
I'll indicate changes on the picture lock version.
With any luck, we can both make it back to the fleet.
No.
Engineering, can you confirm?
Those D7s are faster than us. Starfleet can't afford to lose both our ships plus Ramirez. We'll handle the battle cruisers.
This reaction shot is different. In the rough cut, they were just staring. They weren't turning around.
Helm, come about.
Jakande.
And here Josh added an insert shot of Trey McElwain as the pilot of the Artemis. Trey's not an actor, but he really did an amazing job, and I think we can credit Victoria for directing him in a very strong way. Also notice, I'm going to rewind this slightly, that we have Alex starting to talk while we're still looking at Trey's reaction shot, which just unifies this shot with the next shot.
Helm, come about.
Jakande, no. We'll beam Ramirez to you. We can lower our ventral shields just long enough to get...
Obviously, we added a little special effect there.
Captain, we've just taken heavy damage to the ventral power conduits. It's knocked out the transporters.
In the rough cut, we didn't cut away to Franklin. We actually just heard him as a voiceover. But the cutaway makes it all more dynamic. And then we can come back to a close-up of Garth.
Damn it. Jakande, can you beam Ramirez?
Our transporters are out too. Garth, this is the only way. You've got to get Ramirez out of here now.
This next segment of the rough cut's going to look a little awkward because we didn't yet have the footage of the Artemis chief engineer. But you'll see how Josh handled it.
This is the only way. You've got to get Ramirez out of here now. Engineering, slow to 1/4 impulse, start venting warp plasma. We've got to make it seem like we've been crippled. And Commander, be prepared to shut down antimatter containment. On my mark.
Captain.
I know.
And now get ready for the picture lock version.
You've got to get Ramirez out of here now. Engineering.
Okay, before anybody contacts YouTube with a privacy complaint and blurs out anybody's face, I need to show you all something. The main interlude shoot took place on November 2nd to November 3rd, 2019. Everyone who came to Aerie Studios that weekend was greeted at the front door by our production assistant, Carolyn Shipman, and shown the following paperwork. It explained that by coming to the studio that day, you were giving your consent to being filmed, either in front of the camera or for behind-the-scenes footage. Everyone who came in had to agree to that. Even our directors, Josh and Victoria. If someone didn't consent to be filmed, they weren't allowed inside. Paul Jenkins came to our shoot on Sunday afternoon, November 3rd, 2019. On April 4th, 2021, Paul requested that we remove any footage of him from the final cut of Interlude. We did so 2 weeks later. replacing Paul's shots with the same shots using actor Tyler Donovan. Anyway, this isn't the final version of Interlude. This video is a comparison between the rough cut and the picture lock versions of this fan film. Footage of Paul Jenkins appeared in the May 2020 picture lock version, and these shots can't be replaced or removed without affecting the authenticity or the accuracy of this educational video. We now return to our picture lock version, already in progress.
Slow to 1/4 impulse. Start venting warp plasma. We've got to make it seem like we've been crippled.
Yes, Captain.
And Commander, be prepared to shut down antimatter containment. On my mark.
But Captain, that will overload the engine.
I know.
Yes, sir.
And back to the rough cut.
I know.
Chakande.
It's been an honor serving with you, Captain Garth.
Now, I wrote about this in a previous blog, but I had a real problem with how quickly it shifts. Captain Chakande is sitting in his chair. 1, 2, 3, Chakande standing up. That's way too fast. We tried inserting an over-the-shoulder shot of Chakande getting up from his chair and walking down to the view screen, but Josh didn't like the way that looked. So, in order to give Captain Chakande a little more time to get from his chair to a standing position, Josh cut it in such a way that we shift back to the chief engineer for a second, then to Garth, and then we see Chakande standing and straightening his tunic. What I like to call the Chakande maneuver.
I know.
Now we have a little time for Chakande to get up.
Yes, sir.
Chakande.
Take a few steps, and
It's been an honor serving with you, Captain Garth.
now as we go back to the rough cut, I'm going to point a few things out to you.
It's been an honor serving with you, Captain Garth. Now get the hell out of here. Helm! Hard about.
Now remember, he went directly from get the hell out of here to helm hard about. You'll notice that we changed that in the picture lock, but first let's continue with the rough cut.
The honor is ours, Artemis.
That's Leslie Sawyer giving us an absolutely wonderful, sad reaction shot. But in the rough cut, that's our only reaction shot. When we get to the picture lock, you're going to see a whole bunch of reaction shots.
Helm. Warp factor 7. Now.
This is minor, but you'll notice that when Garth says helm, the camera's still on Leslie, and then it shifts back to him for the rest of his order.
Helm. Warp factor 7. Now.
So let's take a look at what changed.
It's been an honor serving with you, Captain Garth. Now get the hell out of here.
The honor is ours, Artemis.
Now remember, in the rough cut, Chakande says, "Get the hell out of here, Garth," and then immediately gives the order to the helm. In the picture lock version, we hold off the order to the helm so that we can show Garth, and also we can show a bunch of reaction shots. And not just one shot, Leslie, but 3 shots, which really underscores this moment of intense respect for the sacrifice that this other crew is going to make.
The honor is ours, Artemis.
Helm! Hard about.
Now Chakande gives the order. But this time he's not up on the view screen, which creates a distance. Instead, he and his bridge crew fill our screen in its entirety. And now that Chakande's given an order for essentially a suicide run, we get reaction shots from 3 of his crew members.
Helm. Warp factor 7. Now.
And here comes the big payoff with all the visual effects.
Warp factor 7. Now.
This is my second favorite shot, and Lewis just knocked it out of the park with this one too. The direction he got for it was Ares in the background, Artemis in the foreground. Artemis turns hard about to face the camera. In the background, the Ares goes to warp. Camera tracks with the Artemis for a bit, then passes the camera. That's all he had to work with, and he came up with this. Now, if you take a close look at this next one, you'll see that it's actually not a finished rendered image yet. It's still a pre-vis animatic, which means that you don't see the textures on the ships yet. A little backstory behind this shot. I actually didn't want this shot, or more specifically, I didn't like the style of it, which is called a snap zoom. I wanted something that was more consistent with our other shots, but Josh and Victoria really liked it. However, my other feeling was that it's too far away, that we're not really seeing the Artemis up close and getting pounded. And I wanted to really have a visceral feeling of what was going on. So I asked Lewis really, really nicely as a favor, could he make just one more shot for us? And that was this shot. And this time I was very specific with what I wanted. I wanted to make sure you saw the Artemis getting pounded. And I wanted to make sure that you actually saw the word Artemis there on the hull coming right towards you. And since both Lewis and I are classic TOS fans, I told him I wanted something that looked a lot like this shot. And that's exactly what I got. So kudos to Lewis for, first of all, giving me the extra shot, and also just doing such a nice job with it. Now, you probably noticed it says NCC 1657. That is not the correct number for the Artemis. It was originally going to be 1657, but then one of the Axanar patches came out for the USS Hercules with that NCC number, so we ended up having to change it to 1658, which you will see in the picture lock version coming up now.
Now.
That's what I said. Now. Notice this time we have a fully rendered D7 and a fully rendered Artemis. And there it is, 1658. Back to the rough cut, there's one very small thing I want to point out in this next shot.
Engineering. Shut down antimatter containment unit. Now.
Oh, just give that man an Emmy. Warren delivered that line so perfectly. In fact, we didn't have a better take of it, but if you look at the very beginning of the shot, the camera's just a little too out of focus. Take a look.
Engineering. Shut down antimatter containment unit. Now.
Am I being too picky? Am I too much of a perfectionist? Probably. But it was my fan film, and I wanted it to be as perfect as possible. Fortunately, this was fixable. All Josh had to do was come in on Jaconde just a second later. And if you listen really closely, you'll hear him say engineering while the explosion is still on the screen.
Engineering. Shut down antimatter containment unit. Now.
Ah, perfection. Getting back to the rough cut, you're going to see our next two visual effects shots, one of which is still in animatic form, and the other has been fully rendered. See if you can guess which one is which.
Now.
Yeah, that's what I said. Now. That joke never gets old. Yep, this is the fully rendered version. This is actually Lewis's favorite. He calls it the shark shot. Now, remember about a minute ago when I told you how we asked Lewis if he could render one more shot for us? Well, there was actually a point where Lewis asked us if he could add an extra shot, and it happened during this sequence. Lewis felt, and I seem to remember Victoria agreed with him, that there was a little bit too much of an abrupt switch from the first shot into the second shot. As you can see, right after the Artemis explodes, there's this pregnant pause as the Klingons fly away. And then suddenly we have the shot, which is at about the same focal length distance where the Klingons slowly recover. Lewis felt we should extend out that pregnant pause with a wider shot to just show the Klingons flying away even further than this. And that would allow us to extend that kind of moment of silence to really punch it. So take a look at the picture lock version and you'll see the insertion of that new visual effects shot.
Now.
Yes, Jaconde, now. Going back to the rough cut, our next visual effects shot was rendered, but ended up having to be re-rendered, and I think when you see it, you're going to understand why. There's nothing inherently wrong with a very dark visual effects shot. And indeed, we're at a dark moment, so having a dark effects shot would almost seem appropriate. However, I grew up during the 1970s and 1980s, when sci-fi shows always had visual effects shots that overlit the ships, and they always looked beautiful, but not with a lot of shadows or contours. That would come later. I wanted Interlude to have a throwback look, harkening back to the TOS episodes of the 1960s, just with a modern flair that CGI could give it. Also, to be honest, I had to pay for that hole in the ship. Lewis isn't a modeler, he's an animator. So we had to actually pay a 3D modeler to create that hole in the ship, and it cost the production about $150. And by the way, I don't consider that a violation of the CBS fan film guidelines. It's like paying a prop maker to build a prop for you, or paying a costumer to make a costume for you. There's materials and labor and stuff, and sometimes you just have to pay for that. But anyway, since the production paid for that hole, I wanted to see it, gosh darn it. So I asked Lewis to re-render the shot just a little bit brighter.
Captain?
And now we come to the end of our rough cut. And this last scene on the Ares had two different takes, both of them good, and both of them with a little bit of a problem. And I wanted one, and Josh wanted the other. This is the one that Josh wanted.
Captain? Antimatter explosion, sir. Artemis is gone. The Klingon ships are no longer pursuing us.
Mr. DeVille, get us back to Earth. Best speed.
That was a good take, but I thought this one was better. This is the one we used in the picture lock.
Captain? Antimatter explosion, sir. Artemis is gone. The Klingon ships are no longer pursuing us.
Proton torpedo launcher repair estimate, 10 minutes.
Mr. DeVille, get us back to Earth. Best speed.
What I liked about that one was that little pause when Alex says, Mr. DeVille, get us back to Earth, best speed. Unfortunately, there is a trade-off because there's a tiny little glitch in the camera movement. I'll show it to you when it comes up.
Antimatter explosion, sir.
Here it comes in 3, 2,
The Klingon
1.
ships are no longer pursuing
There.
us.
You almost don't notice it, but boom, there it is. So we had a choice to make. Do we use the stronger take that has the little camera glitch? Or do we use the weaker take that doesn't have the camera glitch? In the end, I made the call. I wanted the stronger take. So that's the one we used. Meanwhile, speaking of decisions, I want to transition to our transition. If you've seen Interlude, then you'll remember that after the Ares escapes, we switch over from the dramatic format to the documentary format that was used in Prelude to Axanar. Here's what that transition looked like in the final version of Interlude.
Mr. DeVille, get us back to Earth. Best speed.
I don't spend a lot of time thinking about the history of it, but you certainly think of what you've lost, what that war cost you.
It was a good transition, solid transition. The only thing I didn't like was this little spot right over here where it's a little skewed the way it says United Federation of Planets and all the other stuff on the screen. But I recently found out from Josh that there was an alternate version of the transition that he wanted to do, but Victoria didn't want to do. And that happens. Sometimes the director and the editor don't agree with each other, and sometimes they don't agree with the executive producer. Anyway, when Josh heard that I was making this editing video, he told me about the alternate transition he had wanted to do, and I said, well, hey, maybe you could put it together and I could include it in the video anyway. To be honest, I was curious, because I'd never seen it. You see, Victoria didn't want to do that transition because it led into a take from Alec that really wasn't as good as some of his other takes. And unfortunately, when Josh and Victoria were filming it, there were some time constraints and some logistics issues, and they never got a second take of the transition. And you'll see what I mean in just a second. But anyway, because Victoria didn't like what came after the transition, she didn't even want Josh to bother exploring it as a possibility, so it was never even made. However, I wanted to see it, so Josh has made it for this video, and I'll show it to you right now.
Mr. DeVille, get us back to Earth. Best speed.
That ambush cost us dearly. Captain Jakande, we were brothers in war. But thanks to the Artemis, we made it back safely to Starbase 1. Admiral Ramirez survived, but he spent the rest of the war in the hospital bed. In some ways, his decision was the easy decision.
Now, the funny thing is, I actually like that transition. I like it better than the first one. I sort of wish Victoria had let Josh make it and show it to me, because I probably would have said, yeah, let's use it. But here's the thing. It's a fan film. It's not like we've released it in theaters or on Blu-ray or DVD. We've already made a second version of Interlude when we had to replace Paul Jenkins with Tyler Donovan. So why not make a third version? I mean, there's no fan film police that are going to come in and arrest us for doing it. So you heard it here first, folks. We're going to make a third version of Interlude with this new transition. It's not going to be immediate because there is some work that has to be done. Like, for example, Garth starts off about Ramirez spending the rest of the war in the hospital bed, so we have to take that out from where it is later on, and we're probably going to cut out some other things as well. And then, of course, we have to redo the music because the music is no longer going to match the length of how long Garth is talking. But we're going to do Interlude version 3.0. So be on the lookout for it on the Avalon Universe YouTube channel. Now, there's just a couple more things I want to show you before we finish up. The first is the picture lock version of the segments with Admiral Slater from the documentary section. Let's take a look at both of them back to back without the Garth stuff in the middle.
The Klingons teach their children that a true hunter always cuts the head off of the beast and eats its still beating heart. So they went after Ramirez. He had rallied the fleet, pushed for the launch of the Ares class, and turned the tide of the war. Klingons hoped that by taking out Ramirez, it would cripple our morale. But it backfired on them. Now that we knew that there was a spy, that gave us that one piece of information we needed to finally bring this damn war to an end.
What you'll probably notice immediately is there were shuttlecraft in the first segment, but not in the second segment. That's because Louis Anderson was still working on the shuttlecraft and how they would be flying in the background while we were still working on the picture lock. Also, those aren't the shuttles in their final beautifully rendered format. That's still the rough animatic version of them. And in fact, we spent so much time getting these shuttles lit properly and the levels adjusted. It was a pain in the butt for Louis and for Josh, and I'm sure I was way too demanding, but honestly, let me show you how those shuttles look at the end, because they look gorgeous.
The Klingons teach their children that a true hunter always cuts the head off of the beast and eats its still beating heart. So they went after Ramirez. He had rallied the fleet, pushed for the launch of the Ares class, and turned the tide of the war.
Nice shuttles, huh? Anyway, I don't want to talk about the shuttles, but I do want to talk about the bridge. You see, that photo of the Golden Gate Bridge was the very first thing I purchased after Interlude crowdfunded. I always knew I wanted to see the Golden Gate Bridge outside of Slater's office at Starfleet Academy. But I didn't want just another beautiful blue sky middle-of-the-day shot like fan films and even Star Trek always seems to have. So I looked on stock photography sites for a really nice sunset shot of the Golden Gate Bridge, and this is ultimately the one that I licensed. Pretty nice, huh? However, obviously that's not the way the Golden Gate Bridge is going to look in another 300 years, so I made a few alterations in Photoshop. Here's what I did to it. I added that little covered tramway to the bridge itself. I also put in some extra buildings there on the far side, if you look over there. And then finally, I tweaked the levels a little bit so it wasn't quite as color saturated, since obviously this is going to be in the distance outside of Slater's window. It shouldn't look too bright. And speaking of windows, Louis Anderson gave us this graphic, and so we put the bridge outside the window, we put Slater in front of the window, and this is what we ended up getting. But it still wasn't perfect. Let's go back to the early version. I want to show you something. If you take a close look at the bridge, you'll notice that it's actually blurred a little bit. Josh blurred the background on purpose to make it look more realistic. It's because of something known as depth of field, which in optical physics means if there's an object in the foreground that's in focus, the background, especially in low light, is going to be blurred, slightly out of focus. However, when we added the final shuttles, they were sharp. They were very much in focus. So the shuttles look kind of fake in front of the very blurred Golden Gate Bridge. So through a bunch of trial and error, Josh and I played with the blurring of the background until it was blurred enough to still create the depth of field, but not so blurry as to compete with the shuttles. And this is what it ultimately looked like. Before, after. Before, after. Now, before we move on from the bridge, I want to show you one last thing. And in fact, it was the last thing that we changed in the edit before we premiered Interlude. You see, I watched it probably 6 times as we were adding visual effects, and we were adding sound effects, and we were adding music, and we were doing sound levels. I just kept watching it over and over and over again. And finally, I noticed something. That gorgeous sunset background behind Slater was the same in his first segment as it was in his second segment. And you guys are probably saying, well, of course it was. Why would it be any different? Why indeed? The thing about sunsets is they're very ephemeral, constantly changing. What a sunset looks like 1 minute is not what it looks like the next minute. As a photographer who has taken countless sunset photos, I know that if you're standing there, everything changes, second by second. So I realized that Slater's interview probably took place over the course of maybe 15 or 30 minutes in his office with the Starfleet documentary film crew. And that meant that the sunset out his window at the beginning of his interview should not look like the sunset later on in the interview. So one of the last things I did for this entire project was to go back into Photoshop and take this image and change the colors slightly, darken it a little bit, and turn it into this later sunset. Before, after. Before, after. Pretty cool, huh? I bet you didn't even notice. Well, let's take a look at Slater's second segment and the way it finally turned out. And as you watch it, notice that Josh faded and desaturated the bridge a little bit to make it look like it was through the window. It was more in the distance. It was foggy in San Francisco. And also notice that the shuttlecraft are darker because it's gotten later, so the shuttlecraft should be darker.
Klingons hoped that by taking out Ramirez, it would cripple our morale. But it backfired on them. Now that we knew that there was a spy, that gave us that one piece of information we needed to finally bring this damn war to an end.
And that, my friends, is the painstaking level of detail that we went through to bring Interlude to you. Okay, I only have one more thing left to show you, and it's our final visual effects sequence with John Gill talking. The person who did the voice of John Gill, Orion Akaba, gave us a fantastic reading of the lines. And by that point, we also had the final timing of the 4 final VFX shots. And even though you'll notice in the picture log version that one of those effect shots wasn't fully rendered yet, the timing was essentially locked. We couldn't ask Lewis to go back and redo the shots again. He was already working on other projects. He just didn't have the time. So we had to find a way to make the voiceover match the visuals. And as you'll see in just a moment, by the way, this is the one that wasn't rendered fully yet, although it still looks absolutely gorgeous, doesn't it? Anyway, as you'll see in just a moment, the voiceover actually matches the visual effects pretty closely because the script was already written before Lewis started working on the VFX shots, so we knew just from reading it ourselves how long the dialogue was going to take to be spoken. And as you'll see, it matched pretty darn closely.
In the weeks following the loss of the USS Artemis, a dark shadow lingers over the Federation. The newly unleashed D7 warships prove to be all but unstoppable, taking a devastating toll on the Federation fleet.
It matches pretty well, right? He says devastating toll on the Federation fleet just as that explosion is happening. But this time it was Victoria who wasn't satisfied because she felt that there was too much dialogue squeezed in together. She wanted to give Orion's or John Gill's narration a chance to breathe. The problem was that it timed out perfectly. So if we added any pauses to the dialogue, we would go over this perfect spot where it ended. So what was the solution? We bought ourselves 3 extra seconds by starting John Gill's narration over black. So by bringing on those Klingons 3 seconds later, we had 3 seconds that we could insert between what John Gill was saying and let it breathe more. Take a look and a listen.
In the weeks following the loss of the USS Artemis, a dark shadow lingers over the Federation. The newly unleashed D7 warships prove to be all but unstoppable, taking a devastating toll on the Federation fleet.
And even though there were no edits to the second half of the narration, let's just have it play through to the end.
The tide of war quickly turns, and a growing sense of urgency spreads throughout Starfleet Command. However, as preparations to execute Garth's battle plan at Axanar continue, word arrives at Earth that the Vulcan High Council has reached a fateful decision. Vulcan is withdrawing from the war, and the Federation must face this new threat without their strongest member.
And there you go. That's the way we edited Interlude. It took us 4 months and God knows how many iterations. I mean, you just went directly from the rough cut to the picture lock, but trust me, there were so many stops along the way. 5-second clips, 15-second renders, 30 seconds, minute. So many clips uploaded by Josh to YouTube so Victoria and I could evaluate them and we could all discuss them together. It was a 4-month process. It was a lot of work, but at the end, we edited together an absolutely amazing, awesome fan film. So I hope you enjoyed this little peek behind the post-production curtain. And I hope you enjoyed Interlude, too. Keep supporting fan films, folks. Thanks for watching.